Marco Vangelisti, welcome back to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Oh, thank you, Howie, for inviting me again.
Yeah, we got a lot to talk about. So we were chatting the other day, and you mentioned that our fixation on carbon might be to the detriment of really fixing global warming because we're taking our eye off some other important balls. So could
Yeah,
you?
it's funny because I'm just reviewing the material for the course I'm going to teach in May, and I always talk about the carbon math, which is this construct that says, okay, we have we have a carbon budget, and the idea is that we cannot emit more than, let's say, 200 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere before we breach the 2 degrees centigrade, raise in temperature from the pre-industrial level, which would be catastrophic. And by the way, we have more than 2,000 and such gigatons of carbon already in the known reserves of fossil fuel companies. And then I stumble upon the work of Walter Yene, and I'm going to yank that section out of my course in May because it's actually at this point misleading. And the idea here is that we've been focusing on CO2, right? And your viewers and your audience knows very well that we've messed up the climate in part by burning fossil fuels and effectively transferring carbon from the ground, where fossil fuels mostly resided, into the atmosphere. And by the way, the oceans acted as a massive buffer and absorbed a lot of that excess CO2. And in the process, we have basically acidified the ocean. And so, carbon, CO2 is certainly, a variable in global warming. It is a greenhouse gas. But what a lot of people don't realize is that CO2 only represents 11% of the greenhouse gases. And so the big question is, what makes up the vast majority of the greenhouse gases and therefore the global warming effect? Question number one, right? And question number two is, CO2 is not going to kill us, right? I mean, people that are stuck in submarines eventually suffocate when the CO2 concentration goes beyond 10,000 parts per million. And right now we have 420 in the atmosphere. So CO2 is not going to kill us directly. The way the CO2 is causing problems to us humans is because of the energy imbalance. The fact that there is more energy in the atmosphere that translates into tremendous events, most of them hydrological, right? We have bigger storms, we have droughts, we have, maybe just the climate is being messed up by this additional heat. But the question is, CO2 is just one variable. And frankly, if we only had the CO2 to deal with, we would be toast. Because what's happening is that right now we're emitting, an additional 30, 35 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. And if we're really lucky, we might be able to go to a carbon neutral in a few decades and maybe start drawing down carbon into the ground, which would be great and wonderful. But as soon as we do that, the ocean is going to release the extra carbon that has been absorbing. The carbon has, the ocean now has 38,000 gigatons of extra carbon, CO2, dissolved in it. And as soon as we start drawing down the carbon from the atmosphere, the ocean is going to, release and rebalance.
So is that like if I take a ball, like an air-filled ball, and I hold it down in the bathtub, eventually it's just going to pop back up?
Exactly. So the ocean has been absorbing the excess CO2 that we put in the atmosphere for the last 8,000 years. And we do that not only by putting, fossil fuels into the air and CO2 that way, but also through our agricultural practices. When we plow, for example, we oxidate the carbon that is in the soil and gets basically released into the atmosphere. But this is to say that if we only had the CO2 lever to deal with, we would be toast. So we have, of course, to reduce the carbon emission. That's a wonderful goal, but we have to expand our lens and look at the problem in a larger context.
Okay.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So before we do that, I want to so that's kind of the framing of the conversation we're going to have. I want to talk a little bit about you, because you are, I don't know, would you call yourself an economist or a banker, or because right, you've come at this, like last time you were on the show, we talked about how to do regenerative ethical investing, and we're going to talk about that as well in this context. But I want to point out, like, you're not with NOAA, you're not a scientist, right?
Right. So, yeah, I'm a mathematician, and I happen to work in finance, developing quantitative models for a number of years. I even had a stint in an investment management firm where I was part of a team managing $20 billion in emerging markets equities. And I left the industry in 2009 when I realized that a lot of the financial returns were generated at the expense of others or ecosystems. And I think I told the story last time about, we were managing money in part for environmental foundations. And then I found that one of the stocks we were holding in the portfolio was a palm oil company that had destroyed the habitat of the orangutan in the Borneo by destroying all this rainforest and planting a monocrop of palm oil plants. And that was my moment when I realized what the heck we're doing here. We have financial we're all doing our job, and our clients, some of them, environmental foundation, are giving us money, which we invest. And in the process, we generate great returns, but we're destroying the very habitat that those foundations were created to protect. So that was kind of my come to Jesus moment. And then when I left the finance industry, I tried to educate myself about the problems we're facing, how the financial system works, how the economic system works. And I got engaged with permaculture and with regenerative agriculture, with slow money, which is a movement to move money in the local economy, trying to support the fertility of the soil. So this connection, finance is so disembodied and removed from reality, from both the physical reality and nowadays even from the economic reality, right? Like, think about what happened in 2020. The economy tanked and the stock market went up, right? So this connection is really big. And so what I will talk about today is really, I'm not an expert in atmospheric science. I'm basically just a passionate follower of a guy, Walter Yene. He's a soil biologist and an atmospheric scientist that has presented an expanded view of how to deal with climate change. So this is a brief summary of where I'm coming from.
Great, because I feel it's important, especially in the field that I have been in around health and nutrition, and these days with vaccines and anti-vaxxers and QAnon, that it feels like there is an imperative to sort of trust the mainstream, or you need extraordinary claims or extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. Mm-hmm. So one thing I'm concerned about is that my listeners and viewers are thinking, well, I haven't heard about this. All I've heard about is carbon. Right. And so, like, is Marco some sort of, is he like channeling aliens? Like, where does this information come from? Because I think we have, especially, in the health and alternative wellness community, we've gone nuts. And we've completely divorced ourselves from science, from reality, from evidence, based on dogma and trauma. So I want to kind of ground this in terms of, like, is this different from what other climate scientists are saying, from what, the information we're getting? What's Walter Yene's,
So it turns out, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You can kind of go into, and we don't have to answer all that now, but I just want to kind of raise it, because I know it's in my listeners' ears and minds.
Right.
Like, where is this information coming from?
Right. So, well, here's the funny thing is that we've known that the hydrological cycle is really very, very important on planet Earth, but
Can
somehow,
you define that for people? Like, what's a
yeah, the
hydrological?
hydrological cycle is the cycle of water going from the ground, being transpired by plants, so it becomes airborne, and then it again aggregates into small water vapor particles that eventually coalesce into high albedo clouds, and then raindrops. And then the raindrops fall down to the ground, are absorbed. Part of that water gets absorbed by the soil. Some of it flows through rivers and oceans. And this cycle of evaporation, condensation, and that's what it's called, the water cycle, the hydrological cycle. Okay. So it has been really, the whole fascination with carbon started really with David Keeley in 1958. He basically noticed, right? He was measuring CO2 content in the atmosphere, and he basically the famous Keeling curve, and people can just Google that. Say again?
How do you spell Keeling?
Keeling is Keeling. Okay. The name is Charles David Keeling. In 1958, he basically presented, this curve where you see that, during the winter, the CO2 concentration goes up, and during the summer it goes down, but not down all the way to where it started, right? It goes up like 140 gigatons at the time, and then, another 120 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere would be absorbed by the vegetation, mostly, the forests in the northern hemisphere. And so there is a gap of, 10 additional gigatons at the time of CO2 that would remain in the atmosphere and would add to the greenhouse gas effect. And so he noticed this up and down seesaw that though had a trend upward. And he said, we are, putting more and more CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's a scientific knowledge that the more CO2 you have in the atmosphere, the greater the greenhouse gas effect, and the warmer the planet becomes. And they could look at geological, like ice cores in Iceland, and they still find little particle of air, so they can determine the concentration of CO2. They can actually know the temperature historically, and so they found a correlation between how much CO2 is in the atmosphere and the global temperature of the Earth. Okay, so that's true. That's something that, and I'm not saying that we should not go to a carbon neutral economy and that we shouldn't take the carbon back into the ground. Yes, that's a great, worthy plan. It will take us between 100 and 1,000 years to accomplish it. And the reason is because the oceans in the world have acted as this tremendous buffer, right? We have acidified the oceans. What does that mean? That by putting CO2 into the atmosphere, the oceans have absorbed the vast majority of it. In fact, 96% of what we emit in the atmosphere gets absorbed by the oceans.
So in my mind, I think, like, does that mean the oceans have turned into like seltzer? Like,
yes. In fact, they are trying, and that's one of the major problems we have, is that a lot of the marine life, it's like this very fragile carbon-based life forms that are being dissolved by the added acidity of the ocean. But that's a completely different story. What I want to say is that you really need to look at the big picture. And the big picture, and I think there is no debate about that. I mean, there's just earth science. We received every day 342 watts per square meter of energy from the sun. And we re-radiate out to the outer atmosphere 339 watts per square meter. So in other words, we get a lot of energy from the sun. A lot of it's re-radiated out to the outer atmosphere, but not all of it. Some of it gets trapped by, this blanket we have, which is the atmosphere around the world, right, around the Earth. you know, there is a 1% imbalance between the number of the amount of energy we receive and the amount of energy we re-radiate out.
Okay.
Right. And that is what we have to deal with, is this energy imbalance, which causes, you know, bigger storms and everything else, is something that needs to be managed. The key here is really to look at the hydrological cycle. And the key is really the process of evapotranspiration of plants. So the plants take water from the ground and transpire it. And when you take a gram of water, and I'm using grams because Walter Yen is from Australia and he uses the metric system. And I think the majority of climate science is in the metric thing. So people have to put up with that. But for every gram of water that goes from the liquid form to the aerosol form, you need 590 calories. And that's the way in which vegetation acts as a global air conditioning system. By evaporating air, the plants are moving energy from the ground to the upper atmosphere. And that is the mechanism that we can use to cool down the planet. I mean, that is, you know, we've done, unfortunately, a tremendous job at destroying forests. I mean, there were something like 8 billion hectares of forest around the world originally, and we cut down more than 6 billion hectares, and some of it has revegetated. So now we have 3.5. But you know, if you need to think about soil covered by vegetation as our natural air conditioning system.
So the same way that I would sweat and cool my body down by transpiring water into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
That's what the planet's doing. It's basically sweating to stay.
Right. It's moving. The evapotranspiration is the process by which you take water and you turn it into vapor and you release it up in the atmosphere. Now, there is an additional step there that we need to look at, which is, and that basically in part will kind of connect the dots in terms of greenhouse gases, right? I said that CO2 is 11% of the greenhouse gases, right? 8% of that is kind of methane and nitrous oxide. 80%, the vast majority of greenhouse gases is water vapor. Okay, so water vapor is omnipresent, and it's being, so, you know, if you think about the journey of a drop of water, right? It's in the ground, it gets evaporated by the plant. So, you know, that takes 590 calories per gram of water evaporated, you know, from the ground up to the atmosphere. As soon as it gets into the air, though, unfortunately, we have a lot of haze aerosol micronuclei in the air that then allow that vapor to again turn into microscopic little water particles. And that's basically the vapor hazes that we are dealing with. So once the water gets evaporated, it gets again condensated in this tiny little you know, water particles that hang in the atmosphere and act as a greenhouse gas. In fact, it's 80% of the greenhouse gases when CO2 is only 11%.
So what's the difference between water vapor affixed to these little particulates and clouds? Because we've had clouds for a long time. Clouds are good, right?
Clouds are fabulous. So clouds, so the difference is the size of the water particles. You need to aggregate about 1 million vapor particles to get a raindrop. And so you basically need to have a way to aggregate, you know, millions of this water particle to first create those high albedo clouds. And by the way, high albedo clouds are reflecting 120 watts per square meter. of energy right back into space even before it hits the ground. So
what's albedo? What's a high albedo cloud? What does that mean?
high albedo clouds are the very nice white looking, cottony looking clouds that you see. So if you look out and you see a nice cloud, that's a high albedo cloud, meaning it's white. And what's happening is that when the sun hits it, the energy from the sun hits it, it gets just sent right back into space.
The term albedo is something about refraction or reflection of light. Is that
albedo
right?
is how much whiteness is there. So an albedo, like albino and so on, comes from Latin that is related to the color white. Okay. So albedo means how white the thing is.
Okay.
And the idea, and you know the difference, right? If you have a black surface and a white surface in the sun, the hot is going to, the black is going to get much hotter than the white.
Right.
Right. The difference is the albedo effect.
That's why you walk, when you're barefoot, you walk on the lines in the parking lot.
Exactly. Instead of that's perfect example. And so, the idea is that once you have these hazes, they are a greenhouse gas that is contributing to the problem. How do you aggregate them into high albedo clouds and then raindrops? There are three ways. You actually need precipitation nuclei to do that. And there are three naturally occurring precipitation nuclei. The first one is salt particles, and they are usually generated by waves activities around the ocean. The other one is ice crystals, and those are generated usually at high altitude or high latitude. But by far the most important rain nuclei are hydrophilic bacteria that hitch a ride on the evaporation particles from the plants and go up into the atmosphere. So this is I think this research is fairly recent, maybe in the last 10, 20 years, although actually Pasteur, the guy who found the microbes, found them in the air. So it's not new, but the importance of basically aerobacteria in the air as very powerful rain nuclei that can then condensate this vapor hazes into albedo clouds and eventually into raindrops to come back on Earth. It's really amazing. More than 50% of the rain nuclei is bacteria in the air, and so that's why, for example, the Amazon forest has many. The Amazon forest generates its own rain effectively because it transpires, all this vapor into the air containing this microscopic rain nuclei that then aggregate that and turn it back into rain. And so that is the amazing thing, and what we need to think about, the imbalance between the energy we get, 242 watts per square meter, and the energy is re-radiated out, 339 watts per square meter, is just 1%. So to manage the energy imbalance due to global warming, we just need to manage 1% of the energy, right? And we can do that in various ways. One is by reducing the vapor hazes. How do we create a lot of vapor hazes? It turns out that we put 4 billion tons of clay dust into the air, mostly because of the fact that we created deserts and we do tilling agriculture. And when we till the land, we release dust particles and clay particles into the air that act as a much more powerful greenhouse gas source than CO2 itself.
So those become the particles, the clay dust becomes the particle that the water vapors.
It creates the water vapors, which are, water particles are too small to aggregate, right? I mean, they still remain in a vapor haze. And then you need a different type of nuclei, the rain and precipitation nuclei. There are those three things that I mentioned, the bacteria, the salt.
The clay dust blocks like a receptor, like it's preventing the other. particulate.
What the dust particle does is basically takes the vapor and help condense it, right? So, think about this. When you go from liquid to vapor, you need energy, right? So that's how the plants are cooling the planet, is that, for every gram of water that they turn from liquid to vapor, right? They take 590 calories. Now, once that vapor, gas form of water, if you want, encounters this little particle of clay, it condenses back and it turns into tiny little water particles, still liquid, but suspended in the air. And that's basically responsible for 80% of the greenhouse gas effects. And then you need something to condensate those smaller, water particles, like in liquid form, but suspended in the air. And to get them into high albedo clouds and eventually into rain, you need the precipitation nuclei. And those are those three things: bacteria, ice particles, and salt.
Gotcha. So I've heard something about, like, ultra high tech approaches to climate change. Elon Musk's and Jeff Bezos's and Bill Gates with, sort of have these techno fantasies of how we're going to use technology to solve it. And I've heard about like carbon tubes, but I've also heard of like seeding.
Cloud seeding. Yeah, cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is basically one way, and that's again the idea of engineering the climate is something that makes me shiver, right? But the science is known well enough that salt particles are rain nuclei, that they have been used before. So they basically put some sort of salts. I don't remember exactly, what they're using, but you can take a plane and spread the salts up in the atmosphere, and that will nucleate water vapor into raindrops and create rain. So it has been shown that you can artificially increase the amount of rain in the region by using geoengineering, right? But again, the idea is that why don't we do it as nature does, in a natural way, in a safe way, rather than tinkering directly, with the climate. Frankly, I'm looking at nature, and when people say, "Oh, we need like a technological solution," and they were like, I think what was Branson said, "I'm going to give $1 million to the guy who finds the best carbon way of capturing carbon." I can tell you a fantastic way to capture carbon, and it's called a plant. A plant is designed to take CO2 from the atmosphere, right, through photosynthesis and turn it into food for itself, the microbes in the ground, and at the end, all life on Earth. I mean, and the nice thing about those things is they're self-replicating. All you need is really water. And I think what Walter Jehne talks about is rebuilding the carbon sponge in the soil. So if you put carbon into the soil, and plants are doing that by feeding the microbes and the fungi that are living at the end, carbon residue in stable form in the ground, if you do that, for every gram of carbon into the soil, you can absorb 8 grams of water. So dirt that has no life in it, if you pour water on it, it just will run away, right? But if you pour water into a nice alive soil that has a lot of carbon content, it will absorb all that water and extend the period over which vegetation can do the amazing trick of evaporating water into air and cooling the planet. And there's also the other key idea here is that global warming is really 2 parts, right? The first part is how much energy is re-radiating from the Earth, and what percentage of that is captured by the greenhouse gases, right? So it's 2 things, and the energy re-radiated from a warm body follows actually this Stefan Boltzmann equation that basically says that the amount of re-radiation is a function of the 4th power of the temperature. measured in degrees Kelvins. So basically the amount of re-radiation is a constant times temperature, times temperature, times temperature, times temperature. So one way, so that's the first part of the equation of the global warming. The other one is how much, how thick is the blanket around the Earth, and what percentage of that re-radiation is kept in the atmosphere.
So when the temperature rises just a little bit, it's almost logarithmic in its effects on rate.
It's actually exponential. It's the fourth power, so it's exponential. So for example, this if you're looking at a surface, right, and you're saying here there was forest, and if you know the land covered by vegetation is much cooler than a parking lot, right?
Yeah, if you go, we go down here, we'll go for a walk in the woods. It'll be really, really hot on the way. And the minute you're in the woods, it's not just the sun isn't beating down on me. It's
right. So what's happening? Yeah. So what's happening, which is amazing, right? So the sun energy is coming down, and if it finds leaves or vegetation, they take that energy and turn it into food. Instead, if they just found a dead surface like a parking lot, it just heats the whole thing up. So as
a thought experiment, my dentist office has like fake plants, like silk, plastic.
Right.
If you could create a forest that would have exactly the same biomass and coverage, but it was not real, it was not living, it was just shade from plastic and silk, it wouldn't be any cooler.
No. Well, it would be cooler just because of the shade, but the amount of energy that would be re-radiated out of that would be the same as if you had painted some green stuff on cement. You see what I mean?
Uh-huh.
But in a forest, what you do is you turn that heat into energy and food. And so that's a much better. What I'm saying is that, when we're thinking about this imbalance in energy, so 342 versus 339, we're talking less than 1%. And if you think about cooling the planet, if we were to increase by 10% our forests, we would take care of that imbalance, even less than that. The problem is that we're actually burning and destroying 10% of the remaining forest every year. So in other words, yes, we need to stop emitting CO2 in terms of gases, but in terms of fossil fuels. But at the end of the day, we're emitting CO2 in other ways. For example, by tilling the land, because a lot of the carbon that is in the soil, once it gets oxidated, carbon plus oxidation is CO2, and that gets emitted. So when you till the land, for example, you're also emitting CO2. When they say agriculture is one of the main emitters of CO2, right? It's not so much the gasoline that they're burning by moving the tractors, is the fact that by tilling the land, you're doing a couple of things. One is you're releasing CO2. So you're turning stable carbon or carbon in the soil into CO2 and goes into the atmosphere. You put soil particles into the air, creating vapor hazes and increasing the problem of global warming, right? And you're also tending to dry up the land, so the land then becomes much hotter. And if you compare like a field that has been plowed versus a field that has a cover crop, right? The cover crop is much cooler. The ground is probably 60 degrees instead of 110. And so agriculture turns out to be a major lever we can use to deal with climate change.
So but if you want to plant a garden, don't you have to till?
Well, yes. And I wouldn't worry so much about the garden. I mean, it's like for example, when I weed, I do some weeding in my garden. I leave the weeds in place so that the ground is always covered. Mm-hmm. And then as I plant something in it, I usually make a little bit of space. I plant something. And as that grows, maybe the dry weeds either turn into mulch and compost, or I might remove that once I know that the soil is covered by something. But it's a big difference Of course, yes, if you till something, okay. But it's the industrial size that really matters. In my garden, I do disturb the soil as little as I can. I do pull out weeds. I sometimes, when I put some seeds, maybe I open up like a little trench where I will put the seeds so at least I can see them, right? But right next to it, I still have debris, or sometimes, I sometimes even leave some of the weeds. I just trim them down a little bit until I get the plants I want to get established, and then they will shade the soil.
Gotcha.
But
So you're not talking about
yeah,
backyard gardening here. We're talking about the industrial.
I'm talking about the industrial, and unfortunately even organic operations. When you say organic farming, chances are they're still doing, tilling of the land. And really what we need to do is we need to do conservation agriculture or regenerative agriculture. And one of the first tenet of that is the soil is always covered by vegetation or by a cover. Could be when the stubbles after you harvest, you leave in place the stubble. I know that around the world, a lot of people burn them. So they turn the carbon that is already there and could be redigested by microbes and fungi into stable carbon, and they volatile it. They burn it and put it up in the atmosphere. So the balance is really how much of the carbon you burn versus how much of the carbon you're absorbing into the ground. And that's really key.
So I've flown across the country, and if you fly across the country and you have a window seat and you look down and it's daytime, you'll see looks endless fields, right? Especially around the Midwest, the breadbasket.
Yeah.
Unfathomable amounts of agricultural land. How on earth do you change the system by which food is produced from them? Because it seems like everything was engineered for giant scale, for machines that are going to sort of till and seed and sow and fertilize and
well, in part, I mean, the idea is changing incentives. We have $400 and something billion worth of farm subsidies to the industrial agriculture right now. And if you go from having a monocrop of soybeans or of alfalfa or so on, and you want to do some more diversified planting, you're no longer eligible for a federal insurance. You are not longer eligible for those agricultural subsidies. So in other words, we are subsidizing a tremendously destructive way of doing agriculture when regenerative agriculture is way more profitable. If you don't have the subsidies, if you remove the subsidies, the new way of doing agriculture, which is in balance with nature, using the life that is in the soil instead of killing it, you're enlisting it to produce the food we need. There is, I don't know if you know, David Montgomery is an amazing guy who wrote Growing a Revolution. He was he's a geologist, and he wrote Dirt, the Collapse of Civilization, and looking at the historical record of how the old societies would overtill the land, and then the soil would erode, and eventually the civilization will collapse. And then after 1,000 years, nature rebuilds the fertility and you start the cycle again. And then, he wrote with his wife a wonderful book called The Hidden Half of Nature, talking about the importance of microbes, both for our gut health and for the health of the soil. And, it's an amazing, beautiful book. And then most recently, he published this book, Growing a Revolution, showing how the adoption of conservation agriculture, even in the United States, is basically way more profitable. He basically said, he took a tour of Kansas, and the people that have new tractors and nice farms are those that are doing no-till agriculture and are practicing conservation practices. You can do it on an industrial level. You can do cover crops in a large scale farm. So it's not, and it would be profitable if you didn't have to compete with people that receive $400+ billion worth of subsidies from the government. Corn right now, I think if unsubsidized would be a losing proposition. The cost of inputs, the cost of pesticides and the seeds from Monsanto and so on would not compensate farmers for growing conventional corn right now.
Which I think is, in the course that I took with you on investing, we looked at a whole bunch of industries that are in aggregate not profitable. Right? Like there's very little of our modern industrial capitalist society that's actually profitable according to the capitalist ethos. We're not talking about good for people, good for the planet, spiritually.
Well,
they're not even good businesses.
Right. If you account, that was a study done by the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, saying that if you account for the cost of the natural capital people use, a lot of the industries would not be profitable. If you really had to pay for the real cost of a hamburger, you would pay $200 because you would have to factor in the cost of global warming from deforestation in the Amazon, soil erosion in Brazil and so on, right? So if you really factor in the cost of using nature for free as we do, very few industries will be profitable.
So Mother Nature is like this mafia hitman, right? Like, oh yeah, take it now, but in a few decades.
Yeah, well,
we're gonna, you won't even be able to live.
Yeah, it's funny when people say, "Oh, we need to save the planet." No, the planet will save itself. Nature will fix whatever mess we do. There's no worries. The question is whether we're going to be around or not. And so we need to save ourselves, not nature.
So let me ask you that, because you'd mentioned that certain large swaths of the earth are no longer vegetatively covered, like deserts.
Yeah, we created 5 billion hectares of deserts.
So I try to, if I till some land or clear some ground on my property and I forget to do anything about it, in 3 weeks it'll be covered in weeds and grasses and things. My driveway, which I actively try to keep weeds off of, they grow. What happened? Why are deserts so resilient to Mother Nature reforesting them or revegetating?
Well, at a certain point, what's happening is that life is possible in the soil because of the microbes. And so those are both bacteria, fungi, and so on. Above a certain temperature, you're basically baking all the life and killing it all. So in a desert, it's so hot that there is no life left in the soil. And you need that life to retain the water and allow for additional vegetation. So even in your driveway, if you dig a little bit deeper, right, you still have some soil that is alive. You still have, some moisture out there. And the moisture is there because there is some carbon. There is something to hold it. There is some residue of life. Usually the fungi, once they die, they leave behind the chitin, in their cells. And that turns into glomalin that basically binds the soil together and can allow for water absorptions and so on. So in reality, you haven't created a desert yet because there's not a large enough swath of land that you've cleared. But if you get to that point, then the incident solar radiation will heat that land so much they would cook all the life in the soil. And then at that point, that's it. Then it's game over. You can't, it's very hard to reverse the desertification, although it's possible, but it takes quite some effort to do that. The idea would be not to cut the forests. And that's why one of the things I wanted to do before the end of our talk is show a tool to your audience about checking out whether you have any deforestation companies in your investments. Because I guess my shtick has been that all these problems, climate change, social instability, and so on, it's all linked to finance and investing and what we do with our money. And so that's basically my bottom line, is that if you are not happy about where we're going society-wise or in terms of the environment, look at your investments and you probably find some companies there involved in the things you don't want to see happen.
Hmm. So just to kind of wrap my head around the big picture of what you're saying around climate change and the crisis, I've heard a lot of, seen a lot of research, scientific papers that are more doom and gloom. Like we're at the tipping point, we've passed the tipping point, there's no way.
Yeah.
And you say that they're looking at a narrow slice of the problem.
Correct.
That we have the tools between just stop cutting down the forests, start regrowing even a small percentage of them, change the way we subsidize our industrial agriculture, and that's a clear path to a sustainable climate. And all we got to do is do it.
That's the amazing thing about stumbling upon Walter Yenna's work is that I was still locked in this carbon math things, like we are running out of our budget for carbon. We're going to be dead, fried in 8 years. No, I mean, it's like, yes, we need to intervene and things are getting worse, but we have amazing tools that are a couple of factors of, 100 times more powerful than just the CO2. If we cool the planet by, a couple of degrees, we can do that by land management, by restoring the carbon sponge in the soil, by switching. For example, if we were to switch even half of agriculture in the United States to, cover crops and no-till agriculture, we would cool, the United States by a few degrees, and that would have even more impact than, reducing CO2. And I agree that we need to decarbonize the economy. The CO2 is a problem, but it's 11% of the greenhouse gases, right? 80% of that is water vapor in the air that we can deal with the hydrological cycle, with rain nuclei and so on, or by stopping putting all the clay particles into the air that creates a water vapor. But more importantly, what this greenhouse gas thing does is retain some of the energy radiated out by the earth, and that can be controlled, right? The soil that is covered by ground is much cooler than the soil that is barren. And so even shifting a small percentage of the land mass to green vegetation where it was covered with cement or other things can really make the difference. And that's a nice thing about it. And I would recommend, I'm going to send you a link to a talk by Walter Yenna where he goes into the detail of this, is much more hopeful than people think. Because we've been focusing on CO2, and yes, that is important, but it's 11% of the greenhouse gases. And it's the minority of the problem, both in terms of greenhouse gases and the amount of heat re-radiated out of the ground. And most of it, the big lever we have is land management. Mm-hmm. That's way more powerful. So,
okay. So let's talk about what we can do about it. And so, what I think of is, I'm going to plant a garden. I'm going to, put some trees on my property.
Wonderful.
One thing. Now, the second is me as a consumer. Are there ways that I can change my purchasing to affect the hydrological cycle?
Yes. For example, you shouldn't have any money with the large banks, because the large banks are actually funding a lot of the deforestation. And we can actually look at a tool where you can find out. So, for example, if you have JP Morgan, or if you have, the large banks in your portfolio, you are complicit in deforestation. Do not participate in, reduce as much as possible. And actually, I appreciate what you're saying. We can all do a little part. I mean, if you even put a little planter out there in your cement backyard, you're already reducing the temperature of that area. So this is going to be in part a grassroots movement. And that's what Walter Yenna is talking about. There are now a number of kind of a generation of farmers that see how powerful what they can do is in affecting the energy imbalance on Earth, which is the result of climate change.
Okay, but I was asking specifically, so before we get to investments,
yeah,
as a consumer who goes to the supermarket, who buys office equipment.
Yeah.
Is there any leverage there?
Well, I'm not a specialist, but I would say the way we eat is certainly very important, and eating lower on the food chain, as you've been saying, that's very important, in part because, there's a big difference between animals raised in CAFOs and animal on the ground. When we're talking about regenerative agriculture, there is a role for ruminants to play. Ruminants have basically created the prairies over time, and that's what, they have a key role in increasing the fertility of the soil, right? So that's one thing. So if people don't eat meat, great. That's a great thing to do for the planet. If they do eat meat, they should make sure that it is animals that are on the land, not in CAFOS operation, and they're participating in the regeneration of the soil. So that's one thing. The other one is, look at the major brands and see which brands are involved with deforestation or palm oil or things like that. I mean, like any ingredient that has palm oil in it is responsible for deforestation. So that would be a good start.
Okay, great. So now as investors, so if I just have my 401k and invested with some company, or so with a money management firm, and then I have my mutual funds, and I'm like, I'm just indexing the market. That's the safe thing to do. That's the responsible thing for me to do. You're saying that I'm actually subsidizing the destruction of the planet, of human habitation on the planet.
Yeah. So, and I don't know if I can share the screen here. You might have to give me permission to do that. But I wanted to show you a little tool that is created by this nonprofit, which is As You Saw. They have done really interesting work in terms of peering into mutual funds and finding out whether they're participating into some of the problems. And I'll maybe just give the URL. If you Google invest your values as you saw, SOW, you'll find the tool. And here, actually, yes.
Invest your values as you sow.
Yeah, so here it's actually on the screen now, asyousaw.org. And they have a tool called Invest Your Values. And what you can find out is whether your funds are participating in fossil fuel problems, gender equality issues, gun-related deforestation, and so on. And what I've done here is I have looked at Vanguard FTSE Social Index Fund, right, according to the lens of deforestation. And they get a C, which is a pretty, not good. 17% of the companies in this fund are involved in deforestation, either agribusiness, banks and lender, major consumer brands, and you can actually see them. So you scroll down and you find out that there are 5 holdings in community producers, 4 bank holdings, and so on. And these are the bad boys: International Paper, Tyson Foods, etc., bank and lenders, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley. Those are all companies that are involved in funding deforestation. And major consumer brands: Amazon, Procter & Gamble, the Home Depot, and so on. So for example, if you're buying office supply, don't go to Home Depot. Go to a small store if you can find it. Anyhow, but this is a good tool because they can also look at other things. So the same fund is doing relatively well in terms of fossil fuel, not perfect, but they have a B. They are pretty good in terms of gender equality. They don't have any firearms or military weapons. So this particular fund, which is a FTSE, Vanguard Social Index, still rates pretty poorly in terms of deforestation. And I would say at this point, given what we know about the importance of land management and forest in addressing climate change, we have to really pay attention not to support anything that causes deforestation. It really is an existential issue at this point.
So yeah. I've been thinking about this in terms of food and agriculture, but when you talk about, the paper is like the #1 deforester, like right, we should be what, like using bidets instead of toilet paper, or,
No, I mean,
cloth.
at the end of the, I think, I think there are a lot of levers we can use before going to a situation where we give up all our conveniences, and we're comfort creatures. So, just the effort of purchasing the right thing. So, for example, if you buy paper, I have 100% post-recycle paper for my computer, right? And unbleached. Okay, it's not super white so that you have to put sunglasses on to read it, but that's okay.
Yeah,
I can put up with
you have
that.
your high albedo clouds for that. You don't need paper.
Exactly, right? So things like that. Of course, use the toilet paper, use maybe recycled toilet paper. So you create maybe a market for recycled paper, which is great. The problem with Amazon and so on is that, boy, the boxes that we receive, and how much of that is involved in, getting deforestation, because they basically buy forest products and pulp usually to make all those boxes. So, we can do what we can, but the big levers are really land management policies. I mean, revising, for example, the federal laws around agriculture, the farm laws, the farm bills. I mean, that is really important if we try to support regenerative agriculture instead of the very destructive industrial agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on the current Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, who I know a lot?
Yeah, I have a little bit of problem with Tom Vilsack. I think he's very close to the big agribusinesses, unfortunately. So that's a disappointment in terms of the Biden administration's appointments, which have been quite positive. I mean, and very diverse. But Tom Vilsack I'm not crazy about him, unfortunately. But people can change and can be pressured to do the right thing. I mean, I was thinking that Biden was like a pretty boring choice, but boy, he has done some really good stuff so far. And so I think because of the pressure from the outside, from the grassroots, and I think maybe Tom Vilsack could be pressured too, especially because the science is now clear, that the way we treat the land is really key to our long-term survival. And I hope we get our act together.
All right. Well, and so before I let you go, let people know how they can find you and talk a little bit about your upcoming course.
Yeah, so they can look at ek4t.com. 4 is number 4. And I'm teaching a course.
That stands for something for people who aren't going to.
Oh, Essential Knowledge for Transition. So ek number 4t.com. So Essential Knowledge for Transition, or they can just Google Essential Knowledge for Transition. That's my website. And there's a course I'm teaching called Towards Aware and No Harm Investing. And they can find it on my website, What We Do courses, and then they can find a link, or maybe you can put the link in the notes. And I would love to have you include the link to the talk by Walter Jenne. So, I might have sounded like an expert, but really all of what I've shared is what I've heard from Walter Jenne. And I think it's really worth and very uplifting to get this more expanded understanding of how we deal with climate change.
Okay, great. So I'll include that. And I will say that I took the course and it was great and I learned a lot, and it has affected how I look at how I invest my money, where, before I was completely hands off and thinking, well, I'll just buy, recycled and used stuff. And at the same time, the funds that, are in my name were committing great harms out in the world. And,
right.
And I didn't, I still haven't shifted completely, but I'm more aware, as the course is Towards Aware and No Harm Investing. So I feel like I'm making less and less harm and more good. And
wonderful.
And not doing, and doing it in ways that can also be financially responsible for me and my family.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And again, baby steps, but taking the steps. So you're on the process, and I think that's great. And it is a great feeling to know when you get to a full no harm portfolio to know that your portfolio is not engaged in any of the problems you want to see solved, including climate change, growing inequality, and so on. So that's possible. And the start of the journey would be the course. So thank you for taking it. I think it was fun to have you.
Yeah, I just have this image of like, the parent is seeing their child being bullied, and yet every time their kid gets hit, they give $5 to the bully.
Right, exactly.
We're
Yeah.
There's so many externalities that we live within a system that's gotten too complicated. So I really appreciate your ability to simplify it and to apply. I think one of your geniuses is your ability to apply a math and finance lens to these other parts of life that appear much more complex than they really are, when it's really about inputs and outputs,
Right.
flows. So again,
Right.
ek4t.com, and I'll include all the links and all the books that you mentioned in the show notes for this episode. I don't know what number that will be yet, but if someone just goes to plantyourself.com and searches for Marco, there will be 3 Marcos. You are 2 of them, and Marco Borges is the 3rd one. And the last one we did, I know, is plantyourself.com/421. So if you missed that one, go back, and that will give you a foundation into no harm and regenerative investing.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Howie. It was great to be on your show again.
Thank you so much, and I hope we keep spreading the message and saving our beautiful little planet for ourselves.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Bye.